when I was younger, I'd go home for Thanksgiving, and I remember the first year, I remembered thinking, how come every time I come home for Thanksgiving, I feel like I'm 12? Well, I'm 59, and I still feel 12 around my mother. Okay, so here we go. Hi, Jay. So here we are. And I'm just going to just plunge right in, if I may, because this is a panel to solve all problems in higher education. But I would just like to maybe just go through the panel and ask your assessment in general of the effects of the last several years. Not a sweeping indictment of the corruption of all academia, but what has been the effect of the last 3.5 years on campus culture and academic life in general? Dr. Templeton, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you can say is that there were sort of trends that were already happening that got accelerated by the pandemic. I think there was a lot of people that saw an opportunity. The idea of having remote learning has always been something that administrators have loved, and not having physical campus to worry about, and having a uniform, single instructor in a system that may have more campuses, which is what we have where I'm at in Indiana. And so I think that was, and you can couch it in terms of we're going to make people safe, or we're going to do this, but in the end they're taking advantage of the situation and doing what they kind of want to do and taking advantage of it.
The idea was that you could scale up the sheer numbers of matriculated students if you could make it more remote.
Yeah, and you lower the costs. I mean, everybody becomes University of Phoenix, right? I mean, you have these online, and you can tell. I've been able to tell the classes that I've been encountered that had the most online learning had the most deficits in that learning over the period of time, and we can see that in the class that's graduating now. That was definitely they wasted a lot of time and money, and are going to have to, in their clinical years and as a resident, it's going to have to make up for it, and that's going to be difficult.
In medical school, for sure.
Yeah, medical school.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine medical school online, really. Exclusively.
Yeah. I mean, we were fortunate not to do anatomy virtually, which, as you can imagine, some schools tried to do that, and for our students there was one in-person component, and that was anatomy, and so they did learn that.
Yeah.
But there were other schools that tried to pull it off, and I guarantee.
We tried to do that, but the neighbors kept calling and complaining that their cats were missing. So, we had to nix that.
By the way, I don't know if you noticed that Steve Templeton is the author of Fear of a Microbial Planet. Yeah, right? I'm glad. Yeah. That book is so great. That was the book that I wanted to exist, in the spring of 2020. I so badly wanted to just have one thing to give out to people, to make.
Yeah, I don't get tired of hearing that, Jeffrey. So.
All right, Jay. We all know the truth about Jay Bhattacharya, right? Yeah. Let's give him a hand.
I was considering what I would say. I guess I want to start by saying I think that universities, which are supposed to be a force for liberation and freedom in ideas and in sort of democratic thinking, have actually been a force for oppression during the pandemic. And I've seen this firsthand. I'll just confine my remarks to what happened at Stanford, just to give you, because that's what I know, because that's where I teach. And I'll start with something that's not personal, that I think is in the news and probably ought to be more in the news, is the role that places like Stanford have played in designing the censorship agenda that governments implemented and adopted around. So there's an entity called the Stanford Internet Observatory, but it's not unique. There's at the University of Washington, at Harvard, at a whole host of other places. There is a systematic attempt to categorize ideas and people that are, what to say is a misinformation, but really what it is it's inconvenient to certain powerful people. And that agenda setting, wholeheartedly embraced by universities, is then used by governments to set the agenda for censorship. This is something we learned in the Missouri versus Biden case. They take the censorship, they essentially, the governments offload the defamation to universities and other NGOs. The NGOs then produce a report that say, Alex Berenson is a bad guy, is misinforming, or Jay Bhattacharya is misinforming. And then the governments then go lean on social media companies, say, if you don't censor these people and these ideas, you're going to kill people. And they listen. So that's one. I think that the universities, under the guise of academic freedom, are essentially creating an agenda to censor Americans, often funded, by the way, by the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and by the NIH, the National Institute of Health. So American tax dollars go to censoring Americans. Second thing is that normally before the pandemic, if you'd asked me about academic freedom and tenure, I would have said that it sounds like it's actually I was very naive before the pandemic. I would have said there's not really a huge problem. Like, people are not being canceled. There's some kind of uniformity of ideas, but largely because there are problems in like people in hiring. People don't want to hire people that have you wouldn't want to have a conservative on staff. That would be terrible. That would be ridiculous. But if you wanted to say something conservative, you could say something conservative. It's not like you could cancel. What I've seen during the pandemic was an absolute perversion of this, right? So essentially, it was very difficult to speak out at a university in opposition to the narrative. Every single one of my colleagues at Stanford who did speak out faced either personal attacks on campus. I faced death threats on campus, or they faced, essentially just a hostile work environment. 100 of my colleagues circulated a secret petition at one point during the pandemic asking the president of the university to censor me. Another 100 of my colleagues actually, in effect, excommunicated Scott Atlas, who was the president's advisor, President Trump's advisor during the pandemic. And these same people who are now saying, well, we need to protect free speech on campus, during the pandemic, were wholeheartedly against protecting free speech on campus. Mm-hmm. So that's the negative. Just real fast with the positive. I do see some signs of reform. So, for instance, I think at least at Stanford, the hostile work environment my personally has started to recede. Like, they're now inviting me to things that they once upon a time used to invite me to, and now again inviting me to. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Maybe we have a new president, which I think because the last one was. If you notice how all these leaders, they keep getting like deposed, not because of COVID, because of something else. Right. Andrew Cuomo why did he leave? It wasn't because he killed people.
He touched him on his back or something.
It was, Then there's like every single one of these, like, Dan Andrews, whatever. They're all the. Anyways, our president was deposed for some other reason, not because he failed during COVID, but and that's I think is starting to. So I do see some signs of hope, but there needs to be some honest reckoning about the utter failures of academics during the pandemic. And that first thing, universities serving as centers for suppressing and oppressing Americans, that's going to come back to bite us.
Weren't there wanted posters for you on campus?
There was, yeah. I was accused because my crime was I spoke with Ron DeSantis. That led to people put posters all over campus.
So you went to your office and there's posters on trees.
Basically, these kiosks. I didn't tear any down. Just if anyone asks, I believe in free speech, but. Just putting a mustache. I do not deface them either.
Well, we'll go into more depth in this in a second, but just to get through the panel, Dr. Jensen, go ahead.
I think I'd like to talk mostly about students. I think maybe what I bring to this panel that's a little bit different. I teach basically service courses at a large state university. I teach mostly rhetoric and composition, sometimes American Lit if we can round up enough students who are interested, which is becoming fewer and fewer. And I teach at a branch campus of this large university. And I teach obviously mostly freshmen and sophomores. So I have seen over the past 3 years the kids who were most affected and most harmed by this in high school. I also have a lot of dual enrollment students in my classes. These, if you're not familiar with dual enrollment, these are high school kids who are taking college courses, obviously very bright kids, some of my best students. In fact, I teach a 7 a.m. class twice a week that is almost exclusively dual enrollment students, kids who are coming to campus to take a class before they then go on to the high school. And when we first came back, I'm in Georgia, so we opened up before most states. And we came back to campus in the fall of 2020, but only sort of. We were allowed to meet with 1/4 of our class at a time, which meant I saw my entire class, every 2 weeks. And I had to completely change the way that I did things because of that. And simultaneous to that, I was also beginning to teach online. I'd never taught online before. And just between us, I'm not a huge fan of it, but all of our students are gravitating that way. In fact, last fall, I was grading the first set of papers from my 7 a.m. class, which is usually my brightest students. I'm like, where did all my good students go? And then I got to my online class, and I realized, oh, there they are, because that's what they were doing in high school. I had kids in my classroom, dual enrollment students, who were going to the high school during the day, because, it's Georgia, and it was open, right? They were going to the high school. They were sitting at the desk in the classroom with the teacher and other students, whatever, because parents could opt for their students to be there or not, right? So maybe the classroom was half full. And the teacher is up front teaching online. She's doing a Zoom session with the students that are at home, and they're sitting 10 feet from her on their laptop watching her on Zoom. And I had students tell me, this is why I decided to do dual enrollment, because that doesn't work for me. Well, no, it doesn't work for anybody. It's stupid. I do have a little bit of good news to report, though, and that is that this semester, this fall, for the first time, I really have started to feel like things were just beginning to get back to normal with my students. I saw some of that enthusiasm, sense of humor. Not many students have a sense of humor at 7 a.m., but more than I have seen, and hardly anybody wearing a mask now. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about the future.
The losses, an incredible, just the losses in not just education, but in arts and industry, and it's overwhelming. We'll never be able to calculate.
And some of that is our fault too, and I take my share of responsibility for that, because we did so much hand-holding during the COVID era. And I'm not naturally inclined that way, but I just felt like my students had been completely traumatized by this, and anything I could do to make their lives easier was probably justified. But looking back, I'm not sure I was correct about that. I think I made things too easy on them, and I think we all did. And now, we're having to tighten up. Just a quick example. For the first 2 semesters back, so fall of 2020, spring of 2021, even though I was teaching face-to-face, I had all these modules that I had created for my online classes, and I would post those, even though the students were there, I would post the modules online, you know, in case they missed it or they needed some extra help. And it was about midway through the spring that I realized that students were just cutting class because they didn't have to be there, they could just watch the modules. And so the beginning of the following fall, I stopped doing that. If you want to get them, if you want to take an online class, fine. But if you're in my on-campus class, you have to come to get the material. And I had a student just a few weeks ago who asked me if I would go back and post the lectures online. And I said, no, this is a face-to-face class. If you want to get the material, you have to be here. But I think we condition them to do that, and it's partly our fault. But maybe we're getting past that, and maybe they're starting to outgrow that.
And Paul, you have an initiative you wanted to talk about. Now, keep in mind, Paul is the co-author, along with Gigi Foster and Michael Baker, of The Great COVID Panic, which is the book that inspired the creation of Brownstone. So thank you for that, Paul, your courage and your voice. But go ahead.
Do you want to talk about the initiative?
Yeah, let's leave it up to you.
Yeah, go ahead. So, yes, to answer Jeffrey's question on what's happened to the academia, in many ways it has lost its mission, I would say. And that's been perfected in the last 5 years. So now students are consumers. They're no longer taught critical. They're no longer sort of seen as people whose mental health matters, whose, addictions matter, or whose inability to cooperate with others or to sort of challenge the narratives of their governments or fellow students matter at all. It's sort of not the university's problem. The university is there to sort of drip some things in their minds so that they can pass an exam, and then there's a quiet conspiracy of both the university and the students to pretend that they've learned something, and neither of them has any incentive to break that contract the rest of their life, because then they would both own up to something terrible. The university would have to own up to the fact that they didn't teach anything, the student would have to own up to the fact they didn't know anything. So we're in dire straits. Right? We're in dire straits, and this is kept together by an enormous network of vested interests now. I mean, the unions are in on this. They've got no incentive to break this. A lot of the companies around this, around universities, also have a vested interest in keeping this alive. We no longer send students for sort of, risky travels, or let them do research which might upset the donors, the grantors. Right? And of course, the university is now, in many cases, just a honeypot. There's just billions of dollars in endowments that are there for people to steal or abuse or in any other way put forward towards their own things. So we need alternatives. And I'm part of a group of academics in the Netherlands, Belgium, but also Australia and England, which is going to try an initiative. So it's called Nova Academia, and in 3 steps we want to get to an alternative university. And I want to talk about the first step most. We're going to do in-campus stuff, and we're going to try and, really add aesthetics and do true critical thinking once we're up and going with a physical campus. But the first step is the most interesting one, because that's happening these weeks, and maybe some of you can be part of that. So we're setting up a mentorship program, and the mentorship program is effectively a kind of a self-replication of ourselves, but also looking for others who want to team up with us on research. So for instance, if Jay wants to do something about the history of, let's say, public health, but he doesn't have students who can do that, he could advertise there and maybe say, okay, I'm Jay Bhattacharya, I'm interested in this particular research, I call for students with these particular characteristics, and they could be at school, they could be having a job, they don't need to be at a particular university, but I want them to be that good, and I want them to be interested in this, because I'm putting my time in, so I can choose the project that I'm going to put my time in, and they can apply to him in the following ways, right? Sort of send a 500-worded letter. And the advantages of you to join in with this, because we're basically setting this as an internet matching place, is A, you're sharing a brand, so students know where to find all kinds of potential mentors. And this is for all kinds of things. It's also for people who want to set up workshops, or people who want to set up an inquiry into something, like a censorship inquiry. I'm setting it up. I'm partly asking for people to join with textbook writing, right? I want postdocs for that, and I want history writing, and I wouldn't mind to have a teacher of history history join in for that sort of thing. But the advantage to you, if you're thinking about this, is A, low risk to you. All you basically need to supply us with is a profile and, as it were, kind of a promise. I want to sort of help do this particular research. I want this out of it, but I want that from you as a student. So the safety in numbers. What you then get, if things work out, that's great. You're also then part of a community of scholars. The students will form a community themselves as well. So it comes with software so that you can do video conferencing, you can share documents, you can sort of have online debates. So the idea is to also start initially an online community, but of course we're going to make that into a physical community. And maybe best of all, if nobody shows up for your ideas, nobody will know. We're not going to track that. Right? It's not there to share. So in a sense, low risk, low effort, high potential return. So please come and see me after the break if you're interested in being one of those mentors, because it's very much sort of by us for the next generation. There's only one negative: we're not going to pay you because we're not paid ourselves. So, you know, this is all by us for the future, but it's also meant to activate us, right? I mean, we are, as a community of rebels, still too defensive. We need to become offensive, right? We need to sort of start to grab the agenda, sort of set up new institutions and sort of set the research agenda, rather than writing pieces and saying how stupid the government has been this time, right? So, from defense to offense, please join us.
Well, one wonders about the impact of all of this on legacy academia. I had a distinct impression, and I'm not sure when this occurred to me, maybe it was sometime in late 2021 or early 2022, that there was a kind of purge going on within academia that was enabled by the mandates. Anybody who was annoyed by the mask mandates, was made to feel like we really don't belong here. And then, of course, the vaccine mandates, which were, I don't know what percentage of universities, probably somebody here could tell me, it was like 4/5, or I think most universities in the U.S. mandated that all the students who were ultimately the data set, not really vulnerable to medically significant consequences from COVID, they still had to get the shot, despite
79 universities that are mandated.
Still, 79.
And the woke stuff has kicked out a lot of academics too. That's sort of clean.
Right, and you've combined that with the ideological controls. So, it's hard to believe this is all just an accident in a way.
Doesn't matter. We need to set up alternatives, whether it's an accident or not.
But the universities that didn't do this, and they were mostly, I hope I'm not speaking incorrectly about this, were mostly religious liberal arts colleges, seem to be actually thriving in the U.S. Any comments on any of that?
I think that, like the big research universities, a major sort of underappreciated fact is that a lot of the research is funded by pharmaceutical companies. Mm-hmm. Like they're enormous grants to, especially if you have a medical school, you're going to have pharmaceutical funding of those medical schools. That undoubtedly. It's subtle. Maybe it's not so subtle, but the role that it plays is it's hard to deny. I wonder whether it leads professors to join coalitions to try to, in principle, you could have a university funded by pharma and still have independent thought within the university. But during the pandemic, it sure seemed like it was difficult to have that happen.
There's also something else about these religious colleges, which is that they've done better, they're more independent, they've got more critical thinking than most of the others, but they're still within the system. The system has its clause in them. For instance, via whether or not the students can get a loan, because they've then got to be accredited, otherwise the state won't give that out.
Even like Notre Dame mandated the vaccine, right? It's not like all religious colleges did well. Whereas like Hillsdale, which is not funded by government at all, all did quite well.
Yes.
So I think that the funding is,
But Hillsdale is still accredited, right?
yeah, it's accredited.
And as soon as you're accredited, you're in the system again, because who do you think decides whether or not you're worthy accreditation? And there's a whole checklist of nonsense you have to have as a college. You know, you basically have to promise to be largely useless in order to be accredited.
I mean, in principle, you want the accreditation.
It's not a joke, it's true. There are hordes of administrators being useless.
Like in principle, you could have a college that just takes advantage of students, right? That's the nominal argument for accreditation, is to say, look, this is you're not going to just offer a degree. The problem is, like, the accreditation by itself it hasn't guaranteed that. As you said, Paul, like, there's a lot of like pretending to learn or a lot of pretending to teach that goes on, right?
Well, and accreditation just measures processes. It doesn't really look at outcomes. It doesn't sort of have talks to students to see whether they're critical. It's more, have you got a DEI policy? Do you say something about ethics? Or have you got a mission statement? And do you regularly review your processes? How often? Well, that says nothing about how good you're teaching or how good your research is. It just says how many administrators have you got and how busy are they? Well, they're very busy with the next accreditation.
Yeah, the metrics there have moved into this consumer model of education as well, where it's administrators trying to make the students happy because the accreditation body, their main metric is student happiness and support. And we see this with medical schools too. And so the faculty who actually used to run universities are now actually at the bottom. And you have students and administrators at the top, actually. And I tell the students, even when they're filling out evaluations, look, some of you are going to not like me, and that's fine. But be advised that some of the things that you do not like about what we do came from student evaluations. So we're giving you what you want, not what you need. But that's out of our control now. Just giving you what you want is that's.
I do wonder about the independence of academia in general. I will say, being on this end of Brownstone and encouraging, sort of dissonant thought on all these range of topics, it is notable to me just how few, and you're the exceptions on this panel, but how few currently employed academics have done any decent research on any of these topics that are of interest to Brownstone. Most of writers are these emeritus retired. Have you noticed this, Jay? Emeritus retired professors, people just who left academia. It's like that's a freeing thing for them, and they can now speak their mind. I don't think it was supposed to work this way. Wasn't it supposed to be the opposite?
I mean, principle of tenure is supposed to give you freedom to say things. I mean, I have to say, in my case, it actually did for time. I mean, Stanford didn't fire me. My tenure held. So if you'd asked me before the pandemic whether tenure meant anything, I would have said, don't be ridiculous. It's useless. I have to say, in my case, it did hold. But what I've seen is the opposite also. I've seen people so scared about their social position within the academic world that they didn't dare stick their heads above the parapet because they didn't want their social position to collapse. I mean, it's stultifying. It absolutely, and I think it explains why so many academics said nothing, even though they had deep concerns about the lockdowns, about the vaccine mandates, about the mask mandates, and all that. They had deep concerns. I mean, they would write to me saying, "Thank you for speaking up, but I can't say anything because I have kids to feed or something." But
but it's worse than that. That's totally true, and there have been many academics who have been hounded out in the last 3 years because they were among the few dissidents. But your point, Steve's point, is very, very valid, which is that academics have been at the bottom of the pile in most universities for a long time. Well, then certain things happen. The academics that are left are not good. The good academics don't want to live that way. So most of your academics and most of your institutions are shit. They can't do much. They're still there because they couldn't get a job elsewhere, right? And so you sort of start out with the ones who are sort of, gullible and therefore for the mortgage. Well, what do you expect of them? I mean, if they could do something, they wouldn't be there. Yeah. So the rot goes far deeper than just that, they've been caught in groupthink and that their administrators would fire them if they say something. Mm-hmm. No, they're just really stupid now. It's not a joke. I mean, this is a serious problem, right? Most of your kids now, most of you at universities will have a pretty bad education, unless it's very technical and it's not so bad. But anything social, anything business, my God. I mean, you might as well just give them a book to read and tell them to get a job.
Well, now it seems
a lot more sound from an economic perspective, given student debt and what you're left with. I've been thinking for a very long time that this whole thing is a bubble that's going to collapse, but it keeps not collapsing, because
I don't think it's a bubble. I mean, the problem is like you have to have some mechanism of certification. Like you want to, I mean, this is how, so in principle, the certification can be attached to something real, like actually learning about real life things that are important. I mean, that's the old kind of justification for academics. The need for certification is still going to be there. That's a real economic function to get done. So I don't think it's a bubble. The issue is like, how do you restore the commitment to the things that made academics worthy of respect? Right? How do you restore the commitment to learning, to debate and discussion, to sort of honest scholarship? And that's ridiculous.
Jay, here's the thing. I mean, certification is being done already by the private sector. You know this, but you can have you can have a finance degree and a PhD in finance and get in that industry, and nobody's going to take you seriously in the slightest bit until you've passed your Series 65 and your CFA or CFP or whatever it's going to be in several rounds. And those are your credentials. But you could have passed those, even without an undergraduate degree.
But you don't get in the door without the PhD in finance.
Well, it depends. Right, it depends. But the point is that the real currency in real industry are these private certifications in any case, right?
But part of the problem, it goes back to what Paul was saying about accreditation, because that's not just in academia. It's not just that the schools are being accredited when they're not really doing stuff. The students are being graduated when they really haven't learned anything.
Yeah.
And now the professional associations are basing their certification on things other than competence in the field.
Right.
So it just filters on down through. And so what we're ending up with is the stupidest educated class in history, because so much of what they know simply isn't true.
Yeah, that's right. No, I've looked through these exams in the field of economics, and the private industry exams, and I promise you, not 90% of really existing economists at the Ivy League university would fail these exams. The full professor tenure university, they would fail them instantly. Private industry is expecting things that are not being taught in the academia today. So that's just in finance and economics. I don't know what it's like.
That's true. The economics education is shocking now at university.
Yeah,
it also opens a market opportunity, which is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think they're ripe for the taking. I mean, it's now so done, the existing universities.
It's so bad.
In a way, all the inherent disadvantages of new institutions may be overcome. There is a chance. There is a market.
Yeah, the market works. I think we should take some questions. But the first question should bring the microphone up here, I think. So please. Go ahead.
Hi all, thank you for a great panel. My question is about journals, which is something that didn't come up, but as a professor, what you publish is incredibly important to your career, and journals were just unwilling, it seemed, to publish things that go against the narrative. So I'm wondering, how do you think you address that, shine a light on that, and hold journals accountable for actually being useful and honest in their selection of information?
And how do we make them more public access? This is driving me crazy.
Great question as well.
I mean, the journals utterly failed during the pandemic. You're absolutely right. I mean, like just from the almost the very beginning of the pandemic, you had like the Lancet and New England Journal published these surgisphere absolute frauds. I mean, admitted frauds. I mean, showed that peer review meant nothing in those settings. And then the systematic difficulty in publishing randomized trials for masks that found that they had no effect. I mean, what you saw during the pandemic, I think actually predates the pandemic. Like it's very difficult if you find a result that sort of is counter-narrative to get something published. On the other side, there has been this movement to open science that's allowed there to be some counter-narrative things that come out. That come out. I mean, so it's. I think it's mixed. I don't. I mean, maybe. I mean, Paul and I probably disagree on this, but like I think I have this like desire, like this, just to take up like my pirate patch and just go after the journals. But I don't see how
you and me together, Jay.
Again, I think there's always going to be some hierarchy, and the question is, how do you? I think what's happened during the pandemic is that hierarchy is now much flatter than it was before. Like people still want to be published in the New England Journal. I don't see how you quite get around that. But the fact that you publish something in a journal that's a lower impact factor is not such a big penalty as it once was, given that the top journals have absolutely beclowned themselves.
And having preprints is another positive development where things come out before they've been fully reviewed.
Well, and the preprint issue has been very interesting, right? Because if any of the preprints, you've seen, I think, I watched this happen, a preprint that would come out that would contradict the prevailing orthodoxy. And then there would be this pile-on of established professors who are, fancy people, and said, oh, this study's terrible, it's got to be withdrawn. And then they would withdraw it, right? And then they pull down. You saw this. Am I imagining this?
This happened to me. So I published in April of 2020. I did a seroprevalence study of like how many people had COVID in California, and I published it as a preprint. And there was like calls for me to withdraw the paper from some people even at my own university. It was ridiculous. And actually, the thing gets published in the International Journal of Epidemiology ultimately, and it's replicated by 100 other studies. So I mean, I think. But on the other hand, the fact that the preprint was there meant the message got out.
Yeah.
And it was forced to be put into the public. If you were going to be attacked, it would have to be publicly. Otherwise, it would have been behind the scenes, and no one would have heard about it.
But it was outrageous. Some of the most interesting articles I ever read was with the preprints, and then I would tweet about. I'm sorry, Twitter, and then a week later, people say, "Oh, you better take down your tweet. That article was withdrawn." And it turns out there was a big, sort of organized attack on it.
Well, maybe worse than the ones that were withdrawn were the ones where the authors added a preface or something, where they essentially said everything that we found and that we talk about in the following article, we didn't really find because people don't like it.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Now, I have a different answer, because your question is very sort of deep about the nature of science now, right? I mean, many of the peer-reviewed journals should be seen as beauty contests of academics, judged by other academics.
Right.
And what then tends to happen is that, you get far too much written. There's far too much written, particularly in social science, that is not just ridiculous, but it's just unnecessary. There's very little new, and why keep rehashing the old? Well, because it makes careers, right?
And it can't be replicated.
Exactly. Well, it's that as well, but a lot of it is something you wouldn't want to replicate, whether it's true or not, right?
There's no one cares.
Exactly, and it's uninteresting, right? But careers are made out of this. It's again this accreditation thing. Universities brag with it. Look, we've got so many top fives, and they don't brag with this is what we do for the community, or these are the questions we've helped community with. So it's all internal beauty contest now, and it's not tethered to something real or something that the population cares about. So I think we should think about totally different models, get away from these peer-reviewed journals, and start much more with, let's say, prediction races or community-led questions that universities then address, but not the questions they come up with.
I think that's exactly what's happening. I mean, I think that the days where just peer-reviewed science is the only way you judge whether an academic's doing well that's starting to crumble.
Good.
Yeah.
I mean, Einstein wasn't peer-reviewed. That meant he could still do something interesting.
He was once.
He didn't have to ask permission either.
He was once, but he was very, very upset at the journal editor that sent it out to the peer reviewer. He's like, "Why I didn't give you permission to go send my paper out?"
Didn't Edenetus, his first predictions concerning the IFR, didn't that appear in a preprint? It was attacked.
That was my paper. Yeah,
That's your paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we got that right. We got the number right.
And it was ultimately published by the CDC or something?
He published a meta-analysis of the peer-reviewed literature on seroprevalence in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization in December of 2020. But the April 2020 paper of the Santa Clara seroprevalence study, that was very early. The number we got was smack dab in the middle of that whole literature.
Yeah. Oh, and do you remember what happened when Dr. Bhattacharya published his seroprevalence thing? There was a magazine called, what was the name of that
BuzzFeed
thing?
News.
BuzzFeed.
They went out of business, though. So
Yeah, it's bankrupt now.
they went after my wife. They attacked my wife. There was hit pieces on me, hit pieces on Johnny Amides, all this nastiness. It led to the university actually they didn't call it an investigation. They called it a fact find. But it was really stressful.
Unbelievable. And that was very early on. And basically your paper said, but everybody's going to get COVID and you're going to get natural immunity. We're going to get through this. Right? More or less.
And the number you got is the Diamond Princess number.
Yeah, right.
At that point, too.
So,
Yeah, right. Okay, I want to make sure that please go ahead, but I'm not going to overlook Tom Harrington, our great author.
So I appreciate the discussion about academia, and the subject was brought up about the so-called higher education bubble. And I'm personally of the belief that it absolutely is a bubble. I mean, although I know famously it's hard to judge bubbles until after they've popped. But the thing I see evidence of this, for example, the points about the peer review process, it's sort of like, the cost of education for students has gotten stratospheric in so many cases, and so it's been inflated, and so this peer review process is trying to, in a lot of ways, just, inflate the value of something that's already been numerically inflated beyond what it actually is. I mean, the fact is, I just feel like so much of academia is about justifying its own existence, and it's really warped a lot of, it's in a way led to the sort of brewing catastrophe that we've been sort of part of for the last 3 years anyway. So I just wanted maybe more comments on this, and since I see it as a bubble, then you sort of wonder, how would this bubble pop?
Right.
It's not going to pop like a normal, a Bitcoin bubble or some sort of, asset class, because it's got so much, I don't know what it's got behind it, but it seems like it's just, it keeps on going up under its own power. But I guess the thing is, it's sort of this unseen force that's kind of driving so much of the dysfunction. And how do we address that? Do we ever address that, or do we just kind of accept that there's going to be something that's going to, and maybe what's popping is the credibility of institutions before the actual economic bubble pops itself. But I was just hoping to get some comments.
Enrollment is down, right? Am I right about
yes,
that?
That's not the way the bubble pops. The way the bubble pops is Nova takes off, the University of Austin takes off, the Peterson University takes off. Stanford's still going to be there. I mean, don't fool yourself. Like Stanford and Harvard and those places are not gone. They're not going to go. And so the bubble pops by those places starting to reinvent themselves to meet the challenge provided by Nova, to meet the challenge provided by the University of Austin. I think that these universities, they serve a real economic purpose. They're not it's not an accident that they exist. They're not just purely a thing to create power for its own sake. And so that's why the bubble popping won't look like the tulip craze in the Netherlands or something. It'll pop by reform, and the places that don't reform eventually they'll lose status. And Stanford wasn't always Stanford, right?
I think it'll start with the smaller places first, because that's where the pressure is going to be at.
Smaller,
bigger places will always be able to get the students, but smaller
or the medium
or medium size.
Yeah, mid-tier universities. Because smaller universities seem to have a market.
If they're independent of the way that you're thinking, yes. But where that pressure isn't going to be at those Stanford, Harvard levels. It's going to be after all these smaller, medium-sized universities have changed their model that it will then be adapted. Just like a big business situation where all the small businesses can't afford to compete. And the big businesses want to kind of put them out. There's going to be that kind of fight going on, I think, that will have to be adapted to.
I don't think the bubble's going to pop so much as it's just going to slowly deflate. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing already with things like Paul's initiative and Jordan Peterson's initiative. And I can tell you a lot of kids in my community are saying, you know what, I don't need to go to college. I'll go to trade school. Yeah. And, I can get a good job doing that. And nothing in the world wrong with that.
Or just unthinkable, how about just get a job?
Yeah.
and so it's out there.
So maybe what will eventually...
Child labor are you?
Starting at 12.
Maybe what will eventually happen is that that higher ed will go back to being what it was meant to be, and not this huge overblown thing that it's
That's
become.
right, and all this began after World War II, right? I mean, I know we're supposed to love the GI Bill, and everybody gets an education, but maybe it's not the way it's supposed to be. Sorry, I take that back. All right. Now, this is the author of The Treason of the Experts, the most terrifying, fiery attack on academia ever written. Yeah.
As a recent refugee from academia, I can't find much on the panel to disagree with, except for perhaps the orientation, which is looked at education in terms of skills acquisition. And of course, skills acquisition is very important. But institutions exist also for cultural heritage and the transmission of cultural heritage. When you look at the modern university as an institution, it coincides with the rise of the nation state. In other words, we have universities to socialize people into a way of thinking of themselves as part of a collective. And so it's all well and good that these things come down in their ruination as they are or will. But the question is, how do you pass on cultural heritage and the assumptions about the past and the knowledge about the past, which will be necessary for the creation of new futures in the absence of broadly subscribed institutions?
I have an answer to that because in many ways, of course, the story of us has been under attack, and the collective story of the West, but also in this country and many European countries, has sort of undermined the nation state, right? It's sort of, we're all guilty of something and we're all...
Which maybe
it's bad.
Undermined.
Exactly.
But cultural transmission with the nation state or without is necessary.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, socialization is a fact of community life. And so my answer to that is that this is exactly one of the first things that new academic institutions can do and should do, and something that Brownstone can do, which is come up with new stories about our history that fit the new communities, right? But stories that you can live with, not stories which says, you're evil, you've always been evil from time immemorial, go and die in a corner. But something that's uplifting and that has a story of progress and the future in it. But this is the task, and we can do it. And I also think there's a market for that. I mean, who wants to hear these miserly stories about how bad we are? That cannot be a winner.
Okay, I think we're gonna hop over to the law panel now. I know that the thing says that we are supposed to be taking a break now. Maybe the break can consist of standing up and meeting your neighbor or something like that while we make a transition. If that works for you, you okay? Thank you, everybody. Now, sorry about that.